Hello everyone. Let's walk through the essentials of NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.1.7, focusing on how to prevent non-privileged users from executing privileged functions and ensure these events are audited. We'll also talk about practical advice and implementation examples. What is Requirement 3.1.7? Prevent non-privileged users from executing privileged functions. This part of the requirement means that only authorized personnel can perform privileged operations, such as system-wide changes or user management. The second part of the requirement says to capture the execution of privileged functions in audit logs. Essentially, every action by privileged accounts must be recorded in audit logs for accountability. Let's look at the assessment objectives. 3.1.7a says privileged functions are defined. What are the admin functions? 3.7b says non-privileged users are defined. What are the business functions requiring access? This includes CUI and non-CUI tasks. 3.1.7c says non-privileged users are prevented from executing privileged functions. This is a key. Users that don't need admin rights are prevented from the admin account. And finally, 3.1.7d, the execution of privileged functions is captured in the audit logs. Finally, all actions are captured in audit logs. Assessors will look for clear definitions and practical control measures. Each objective ensures you know who can do what and how you capture and monitor these actions. Let's look at examples of privileged functions. User account creation, deletion, or modification. Installation or removal of software, changing system configurations, and accessing sensitive audit logs. Remember, privileged functions involve any ability to impact system security, stability, or data confidentiality. Only trained and vetted staff should perform these functions. Now let's define the types of privileged users. Privileged users include system administrators, network engineers, and possibly facility security officers if they need to access security camera footage, for example. Non-privileged users include regular employees and end users without system-level permissions. This includes users for CUI, FCI, and commercial only. In summary, privileged users have access based on job duties. Non-privileged users cannot perform administrative tasks. And the separation of duties is central to compliance and security. Preventing unauthorized actions. Use RBAC or role-based access control to assign privileges. Limit local admin permissions. Regular users should have no access to administrative tools. Audit your environment to make sure no privilege creep occurs. Let's talk about your organizational procedures for implementing and deploying 3.1.7. First thing is to define and document privileged roles and functions. Remember to document your access control policy, and these roles and functions will be included. 2, review user access quarterly. This is suggested and could be more frequently. Schedule regular reviews to detect and remove unnecessary privileges. Remember to clearly show this process in your SSP or System Security Plan. And remember, for these items, you'll need to configure systems for RBAC and use unique administrative accounts. If you're a system administrator, how do you implement Microsoft GCC? In Microsoft GCC, or Government Community Cloud, use built-in tools to manage and monitor privileged access. Use Azure AD or Entra ID for role assignments. Of course, enable privileged identity management to enforce just-in-time access and maintain full audit trails for privileged accounts. Enable and review audit logs for admin actions. And you can access all of these tasks by way of Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance portal. Okay, let's talk about evidence that an assessor will ask for to show compliance. One would be the documented access control policy. This may be the first thing requested. Another is system configuration screenshots. They can also request records, screenshots, and procedures from your administrator. How about sample audit logs of privileged actions? And of course, the list of privileged and non-privileged account users. And remember, results of periodic access reviews. There needs to be periodic audits and reviews. Prepare these artifacts for assessment. Assessors will want tangible proof that controls are in place and effectively enforced. And you'll need information like this to manage and maintain your system properly. Okay, what are the key takeaways for preventing non-admins and performing admin work? First, define and document privileged functions and users. Next, technically in your GCC tenant, technically enforce separation and track actions in your GCC tenant. Remember to regularly review and audit privileges and maintain logs to demonstrate compliance. Remember that focusing on clear definitions, strict enforcement, and continuous monitoring and maintaining evidence will keep your organization compliant and secure. Use available tools and automate and monitor as much as possible. We'll pause here for any questions, or you can email me at jim@cpisys.com or jgoodrich@manixconsulting.com. Thank you. Okay, let's look at NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.1.8. Let's walk through the essentials of NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.1.8, focusing on how to limit unsuccessful login attempts. We'll look at practical advice and implementation examples for DoD contractors. Here's the requirement and assessment objectives for limiting unsuccessful login attempts. It's part of CMMC Level 2 access control. Limiting unsuccessful login attempts is about protecting systems from repeated login failures, essentially preventing attackers from guessing passwords by trial and error. This is called brute force attacks, and this control reduces that risk. And remember, not meeting this requirement risks failing a CMMC Level 2 assessment. Let's look at the detail of the requirement for limiting unsuccessful login attempts. There are two assessment objectives, A and B, also known as determination statements. 318A, define and document the means to limit unsuccessful login attempts. What's our method or procedure for doing this? Then 31B, we implement the defined means. Assessors will look for two things. Have you formally defined how many login attempts are allowed? What happens after we reach that point? And have you actually set up your systems to enforce this? So, examples of actions. What to do to limit unsuccessful login attempts or logon attempts. Establish a number of maximum attempts, for example 5. Then lock the user account. Implement a delay period of time after 5 attempts is reached. And reset lockout after defined period. In effect, 15 minutes. This is a common approach. After 5 failed attempts, lock the account for 15 minutes. Or your process might say not just 15 minutes or until an admin unlocks it. That's your policy. Both approaches are effective. What's important is that something happens to block further logon attempts. Let's look at your organizational procedures as a contractor. First off, document the number of maximum failed attempts in your policies. This would include your access control policy and maybe within your employee handbook acceptable use policy. Of course, detail the lockout process. Be sure to include the period of duration, the reset conditions, and the unlocking process. This will be included in your procedures. And super important here, communicate these policies and procedures to users. A documented procedure is only as good as the use. For example, in a user manual, say during orientation or retraining annually. Remember, your SSP must clearly outline or reference the chosen policy, including number of attempts, lockout, duration, so that all staff know what to expect. This is both a technical and a procedural requirement. Okay, how do we implement this control in the Microsoft Government Community Cloud, or GCC? Configure Entra ID or Azure Active Directory for sign-in and lockout policies. Microsoft's GCC default is 10 failed attempts and 1-minute lockout, but it's recommended to adjust that default setting down to 5 attempts and increase the lockout period to 15 minutes, or even until admin reset. And of course, document those settings in your system security plan, or include references to your access control policies or procedures, which will include these defined settings. So Microsoft GCC admins can configure these settings by way of the Azure portal. Remember to tighten up the Microsoft defaults for CMMC Level 2 compliance, and ensure that these settings match what's documented in your SSP. Let's look at assessment considerations. Remember, assessors will review both documentation and technical enforcement. They will examine evidence, interview employees, or test a process, essentially doing a review of everything. Be ready to show your policy and where it's configured in your systems. An assessor may request screenshots or ask you to demonstrate lockout. Inconsistent policy versus implementation may cause an assessment failure. So, if procedures and technical controls don't match, you'll need to fix this before an assessment. Let's continue to look at examples of acceptable evidence. We'll talk about this more. SSP excerpt or reference to defined policy or statements. This will be in your access control policy. Screenshot of lockout settings, Entra ID, Azure Active Directory. System logs showing lockout after failed attempts. And training records or communications. We're reviewing this evidence, and it must demonstrate both the defining and implementing of the control. A screenshot, say combined with the log excerpt and policy documentation, is compelling proof of compliance for an assessor. Key takeaways, let's look at one more review. Define and implement logon attempt limits. Align your technical controls with your documented policies. For admins, test your controls regularly. And of course, proper documentation is critical. Limiting unsuccessful login attempts is fairly straightforward, but it's a very essential control. Strong documentation and implementation, not just one or the other, are needed for CMMC Level 2 compliance. Thank you. If you have any questions, we'll pause at this time, or please feel free to email me at jim@cpisys.com or jgoodrich@manixconsulting.com for any questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.